But we're going to talk about him because this now gives him a massive, he had a big platform already, but this now gives him a massive global platform to push his radical, Great Reset World Economic Forum agenda, does it not?
It certainly does. And, as I mentioned to you this afternoon, he had been dubbed the Sustainable Prince. The person who kind of gave him that name was a lady by the name of Joan Vion. She was an author and a researcher, and had done extensive research into all of this. I had the pleasure of getting to know her. And after we got off, I looked up some things today, and I found something that she said I thought was very interesting. She said that first of all, when the U.S. Senate ratified the United Nations Charter, America reverted back under British rule, and that was fulfilling the goals of Cecil Rhodes. She went on to say that what this means is that Prince Charles, as the heir to the British throne, has a bigger role to play in world affairs than what people could imagine. And the result behind the scenes, just to give you an idea, just 14 months before the UN had its Earth Summit in 1992 that released Agenda 21, Prince Charles brought together a group of people who were leaders in all this stuff. They met in his yacht, the Britannia, off of the coast of Brazil. This included Al Gore and officials from the World Bank, chief executives from Shell and British Petroleum, and key NGOs, and Maurice Strong, who was the chairman of the Earth Summit. He brought all of those people together to begin to put all this stuff in place. So he was heavily involved.
So he was there with Maurice Strong. Was this before the Earth? This was before the Earth Summit.
Yeah, this was about 14 months before the Earth Summit, and the goal was to put all that together for the Earth Summit.
So Prince Charles has been behind this the whole way since the early 90s.
He is the main force behind the whole sustainable development program. Yeah, that's according to what Joan was writing. Yeah.
Wow. And, of course, Maurice Strong, who's dead now, of course, as you know, ran the whole thing, was the face of it, got praised on video in Brazil at the Earth Summit by President George H. Bush. That's in my documentary, Sabotage or Siege. And Maurice Strong, as you know, is the one that said, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? So that's Maurice Strong. So fascinating. Well, I knew if I had you back tonight, you'd surprise us with something, and that's the headline tonight. Prince Charles was one of the originators of Sustainable Development Agenda 21, Agenda 2030.
Yep, he sure was.
Well,
and
no wonder
one of the major pushers for it today.
Well,
and now
brags.
He's going to be king of England.
And I wondered why he was bragging in some videos that he's been doing this for 40 years. Now we know why. Watch this video.
At this late stage, I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people, and planet. With the planetary emergency so critical, with the permafrost melting in Siberia, for instance, producing dire effects on global warming, and with the Pantanal in Brazil being consumed by unprecedented numbers of fires, we could no longer go on like this, as if there was no tomorrow and no ultimate reckoning for our abuse of nature. So, what do we do? Without doubt, we must now put ourselves on a warlike footing, approaching our action from the perspective of a military-style campaign. That way, working together, we can combat this most grave and urgent challenge. If we have the resolve to shift our trajectory, we must start now by bringing forward our net zero target. I'm afraid 2050 simply suggests we have room to delay.
Wow. A 2050. He wants to go to net zero. Explain to our audience what net zero will mean for everyone watching tonight.
The net zero is the global plan to completely end man's emissions that into the atmosphere, and the cause of climate change in their minds. And I've said many times, if you have no climate footprint, you are dead, because it's impossible to live life without something like that. But this whole attempt to stop us from using emissions of CO2 and all of that is absolutely insane, because all the plants need CO2. It's what feeds them. It's what makes our food plants grow. It's what makes the trees and so forth grow. And we now are finding, some scientists have now begun to report that we are having a massive CO2 shortage, and our plants are starving. We need at least 1,600 parts per million of CO2 to have natural plant growth. And according to several reports, we're down around 300 to 400 parts per million. That is starvation, and that is danger. And yet they continue to push, we're going to get rid of all CO2. And these are the people who believe that we are going to save the planet doing all this, who know absolutely nothing about the environment and how it operates. This is what we're dealing with.
Well, and
he wants to bring the army out.
Yeah, military style, use a military style of approach. And of course, if you go to net zero, that means people have to offset their breath. They'll have to offset that they're breathing, that they're using their car, that they're using their air conditioning, their heat. So they're going to have to buy carbon credits. And I did the math on that and what that would start to cost. And it would be very, very crippling for many families, particularly in an inflationary cycle where people are having a hard time paying their grocery bills and their utility bills and their gasoline bills. Then you add on to it a global carbon tax, which, by the way, you end up buying it from companies tied back to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and some of these guys that are starting this company. We've talked about it here. We've showed the website. So this is a big scam. This is a big Ponzi scam, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And, Europe started way before we did in getting all of this solar energy and wind power together, and getting rid of fossil fuels and getting rid of nuclear power and all of that. Today, all Germany, England, France, these countries are all starving for energy. England is the leader in it all. They're 30% higher. Their energy costs are 30% higher than the next most expensive nation in the world on energy. And they're dying. And what they started to do was begin to reopen the fracking mines, reopen the coal mines, and begin to move in that direction, because they were starving to death for energy. And here we are, as they're doing that, realizing what's happening. We have the Biden administration, United States, moving in that direction to do it to us. And as you say, it is a massive Ponzi scheme, and there is no science behind it. And they lie and lie and lie to put this stuff in place. If you look at the plans, look at the 17 goals of Agenda 2030, and what you're going to see, not environmental protection, you see controls over the economy, controls over the food supply, controls over energy. This is all designed to have what Prince Charles wants, that global control, and he sees himself, I think, as the king over all of that. And national sovereignty would be gone, private property would be gone, your ability to transport, go where you want to go in your own transportation, gone. They want to move people with smart growth programs into the cities off of rural areas. There they can control your energy use and the building that you live in. This is all designed to mold us and herd us into a certain way of living, and they control it. And that's what's behind all of this.
Watch this next clip from now King George III.
How devastating a global cross-border threat can be. Climate change and biodiversity loss are no different. In fact, they pose an even greater existential threat, to the extent that we have to put ourselves on what might be called a warlike footing. Having myself had the opportunity of consulting many of you over these past 18 months, I know you all carry a heavy burden on your shoulders, and you do not need me to tell you that the eyes and hopes of the world are upon you. To act with all dispatch and decisively, because time has quite literally run out. The recent IPCC report gave us a clear diagnosis of the scale of the problem. We know what we must do.
Let me just stop right there and look at that UN flag. Go back, look at that United Nations flag, which the UN is largely made up of Marxists and Islamists, the red-green axis. You've got nations that many of them do not respect human rights, are basically death cults. And there he is, right there, the UN flag right behind him. Let's keep going.
With a growing global population creating ever-increasing demand on the...
Oh, wait a minute. Ever-increasing demand on the planet's finite resources. So here we go. He's a Malthusian. He believes there are limited resources, therefore we have to have a limited population, which means, therefore, depopulation or eugenics. Wow.
Planet's finite resources. We have to reduce emissions urgently and take action to tackle the carbon already in the atmosphere, including from coal-fired power stations.
Okay, kiss your cheap fuel goodbye.
Putting a value on carbon, thus making carbon capture solutions more economical, is therefore absolutely critical.
Therefore, carbon credit swaps. Again, a global tax tied right back to the UN, being pushed by a bunch of guys that, from what we've seen with the company that we've seen created by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and others involved, they're all going to be involved. It looks like, again, instead of the Federal Reserve, which is a group of private banks giving a federal charter, these guys are going to get a global charter and they get a piece of the action. So big government and big business representatives, big government representatives, they're going to cash in on this global tax called carbon tax.
Yeah, that's what you see happening. The whole thing with public-private partnerships, these global corporations working hand in hand with government, and these corporations are basically becoming our government, and telling us how we had to live, dictating what the science will be, and so forth. Global corporations doing that, and we have no say over that. Do we elect them? No. And so they're working hand in hand with this global cabal to put all of this stuff in place. I know you know that I just returned back from Iowa, where we went there to really fight the carbon capture pipeline that they are putting there. And this is, as I've said several times, the dumbest plan I have ever seen the environmentalists come up with. And boy, that says something. And, capturing the carbon emissions coming out of pipelines and so forth and putting it in this pipeline to bury it underground, to take it out. And as I said in the very beginning, we have a CO2 shortage, and this is only going to make it worse. And here he is, how dire it is. We've got to do this. We've got to stop these emissions and so forth. And, they're starving the earth. If environmentalists know anything about the environment, they would know this was crazy. But instead, it's not about that. The environment is the excuse. They came up with this diabolical plan to get us all to voluntarily give up our liberties by using the scare tactic of, and I've had environmentalists get in my face and say, it doesn't matter how many rights you think you have if you don't have a planet to stand on. This is what we're dealing with these people. It's a scare tactic. It's not true. There is no melting of the polar ice caps. There is no flooding of islands and so forth. None of that stuff is happening. And if you look at the dire problems we have in our society, it's coming from these idiotic environmental regulations that are shutting down our energy, shutting down our food supply, and everything else that goes with it.
Absolutely. Well, Sky News over in Australia, that guy agrees with you. Listen, you didn't know I had this queued up ready to go, but he's backing you up on what you're saying, Tom DeWeese of AmericanPolicy.org. Listen to this.
Good pub, this one. I've been there. But there might be a bit of a warning there for his namesake, the future King Charles III, and his constant advocating for the neo-fascist corporatist Great Reset. If this isn't treasonously selling Britain and Australia out to foreign interests, I don't know what is.
We have no alternative, because otherwise unless we take the action necessary and we build again in a greener and more sustainable and more inclusive way, then we will end up having more and more pandemics and more disasters from ever accelerating global warming and climate change. So this is the one moment, as you've all been saying, when we have to make as much progress as we can.
What a complete fruitcake. But the year 1659 is also important because it's the start date of the Central England Temperature Recordings, the CET data set I have referred to here.
Okay, what he's going to go on here is lay out the weather pattern. He's going to go on to lay out the weather pattern, Tom, and show that we're not actually getting hotter. We actually have cycles in the whole system. Yeah, you want to say something before I continue, Tom?
I was just going to say, as we've always had throughout the entire history of the Earth, cycles in the weather. Sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's hot. We'll always have weather or not. You know?
Yeah, and this gentleman from the Sky News over in Australia starts going into solar flares, sunspots, solar flares. So this is it's up and down. It ebbs and it flows. You made a good comment on my radio show today about Plymouth Rock. According to these characters, you shouldn't be able to step on Plymouth Rock anymore, should you?
Yeah, I mean, 1620, the Pilgrims came over and stepped on that rock that was above water in the bay and got on land. Today, it's still above water, and you can still step on it and get on the land. So all their scare tactics of the sea level is rising and so forth is an absolute lie.
It's not. An absolute lie. Absolutely.
Date of the Central England Temperature Recordings, the CET dataset I have referred to here before, which is a helpful resource for us to measure real as opposed to made up.
Bottom line is he shows that all this talk about how we're all going to burn up, this was a report from May of 2021, is one of the coolest times on record.
Yeah, well, this is the thing that when there are, as you mentioned, solar flares, storms on the sun, we have more warming. When the sun is calmer, as it has been recently, we have less. We had here in Virginia, where I reside, in April, on my birthday, a snowstorm. And, you know, this is unheard of. That it's not warming. It is changes that go into it. We've been going into a bit of a cooling period for the last several years. There has not been any registered warming through any true science investigation in the last 7 or 8 years.
Here's another clip from the guy Sky News, if it'll play. He's hilarious. I like him. Listen to this.
I do too.
Germans.
Die gegenwärtige Pandemie und der Klimawandel haben eines gemeinsam. Sie kennen keine Grenzen und zeigen uns.
My mistake. That was, of course, the heir to the throne of Australia and Great Britain, Prince Charles, now selling his eco-fascist fantasy of the Great Reset to the Germans themselves. Or should I say, der große Neustart, as Klaus Schwab and his cronies call it in their native tongue. This is the grand plan developed by the World Economic Forum that we chatted to James Dellingpole about, in cahoots with the United Nations, in league with the International Monetary Fund, and supported by all sorts of prestigious institutions, including, apparently, the Crown of England, who have yet to disown Prince Charles's ever-increasing and unhinged rantings. This is the Great Reset, der große Neustart, promised to begin next year to transform all Western economies, including ours, by transferring the authoritarian tools currently being used to eradicate the coronavirus, i.e. lockdowns and forced business closures, even stealing your own property rights, to tackle the imaginary climate crisis. You won't own anything and you'll be happy, is one of their utopian communist slogans. Seriously. Not sure your subjects would agree with that one, Prince Charles. Prince Charles's decision to throw his lot in with these crazies and now sell this eco-corporate fascism in the German tongue is unfortunate timing, to say the least.
Plastered everywhere, the only news is the death of Queen Elizabeth II who lived from 1926 to 2022 and has been the longest serving monarch in British history. And she's now dead, and ascending the throne in her place is formerly Prince Charles, now known officially as King Charles III. So the first I heard about this morning, I checked my emails as I got up and saw an email from someone saying that Queen Elizabeth had died at 96, making way for the Antichrist to ascend the throne. And I thought, interesting. So I had a look, of course, and saw all the news then of Queen Elizabeth's death and about Prince Charles now being King Charles III. So it got me thinking that there are a lot of people that believe that, well, King Charles is the Antichrist. There have even been books written about Prince Charles being the Antichrist, and I won't go into all the details as to why, but I'm sure there'll be loads of searches being put into Google and so on today as to the possibility that Charles is the Antichrist. Being part of the British Commonwealth, New Zealand has still recognises the monarchy, and so Charles is now the king for us here in New Zealand, and of course Canada and England and a number of other places, Australia, are still part of the British Commonwealth, so he is the king for all of those countries.
The Prince of Wales is king after the longest royal apprenticeship in history.
He'll be the best prepared monarch we've ever had, having served so long as sort of tutelage under his mother.
As Charles now prepares to ascend the throne, what does he do with it? Will it be more striking to us when it's held by a man that we've seen grow up as opposed to Queen Elizabeth? What are the qualities that the British monarchy represents? That's the question that Charles is going to now have to answer.
Now, as far as the possibility of Charles being the Antichrist goes, I'm not going to go into a lot of the details on it. A lot of it revolved around the 666, supposedly, with him being the Prince of Wales. Well, he's no longer the Prince of Wales, he's the king. So I'm not sure how that changes people's interpretation of it. But one thing, and I'm not going to get into whether he is or isn't the Antichrist, but I will say this, that Charles is a big advocate for the Great Reset. He was one of the voices that was with Klaus Schwab in 2020 when it was announced, the Great Reset, and Charles put part of the video announcement. He had his own announcement in there. He's also a pusher of climate change agendas, Agenda 2030, and so forth.
We have a golden opportunity to seize something good from this crisis. Its unprecedented shockwaves may well make people more receptive to big visions of change, and global crises like pandemics and climate change know no borders and highlight just how interdependent we are as one people sharing one planet.
Charles, it was a big week for Prince Charles, a kind of culmination of 50 years work on the environment, and he launched what's called the Terra Carta. Then it's sort of an Earth Charter, which has been named after the Magna Carta.
According to longtime advocate for nature, Prince Charles, it's one of many examples of why urgent action is needed on climate change.
It is now rapidly becoming a comprehensive catastrophe that will dwarf the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. At this late stage, I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people and planet. We must now put ourselves on a warlike footing.
Whether he has any real teeth is the issue I have in question. He's symbolic as the king, but the king is not supposed to, British king is not supposed to get involved in politics and so forth. Now, while he was the prince, he was free to do that, but now that he's the king, that changes things. He's also not as well liked as Elizabeth was, as the Queen. Whether Charles could rally people around him that well, time will tell. But I think it's just important for people to be aware that this change has taken place, and to be watchful. It is very interesting that Queen Elizabeth's last job as a monarch really was appointing the new Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, only a couple of days before her death.
As a young Lib Dem, Liz Truss called for the abolition of the monarchy. But today she has been appointed by the Queen as her 15th Prime Minister. It's a day of firsts. Truss is the first PM to share the monarch's name. And never before during her reign has Queen Elizabeth II appointed the new country's leader at Balmoral. The last time this happened was almost 140 years ago, when Queen Victoria appointed Lord Salisbury. The ceremony, which took place in the drawing room, is known as the kissing of hands, although there is no kissing and instead just a handshake. The conversation, like the weekly meetings between Prime Minister and monarch, was private, but what we do know is that the Queen will have asked the new leader if she will form a government. Shortly before Truss arrived to take up the mantle, the Queen dismissed outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson from his role.
So we now have a big change, having a new Prime Minister in Britain and a new King over the British Commonwealth.